January 17th, 1940, North Atlantic. The iron hull groans beneath the weight of 40 meters of black water. Inside U-47, the air tastes of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and corroded metal. Kapitan Lieutenant Günther Prien stands in the control room, his hands steady on the periscope grips, eyes scanning the gray horizon where sky and sea merge into a single shade of oblivion. The temperature hovers just above freezing. Condensation drips from every surface, pooling in the bilges where it mingles with oil and seawater. Around him, 39 men move through their duties with the precision of clock mechanisms, silent, efficient, deadly. They are Rudeltaktik. They are the Gray Wolves. And in this moment, beneath the crushing pressure of the Atlantic, they believe themselves invincible. The wolf pack doctrine was born from necessity and refined through arrogance. After the Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of its surface fleet, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz built his strategic vision around a single principle. The submarine could strangle Britain into submission, not through honorable surface engagement, but through methodical devastation of merchant shipping. The U-boat arm would hunt in coordinated groups, surfacing at night to attack convoys with deck guns and torpedoes, then vanishing beneath the waves before escorts could respond. Dönitz calculated that sinking 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month would force Britain to surrender within a year. In the early months of 1940, his mathematics seemed prophetic. U-boats prowled the Atlantic approaches like apex predators, sending tankers and freighters to the bottom with casual efficiency. British sailors called this period the happy time. German submariners called it vindication. Prien himself embodied the spirit of the Gray Wolves. 4 months earlier, in October 1939, he had navigated U-47 through the supposedly impregnable defenses of Scapa Flow and torpedoed the battleship HMS Royal Oak, sending her to the bottom with 833 British sailors. Hitler personally decorated him with the Knight's Cross. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels paraded him through Berlin as the living embodiment of Aryan martial superiority. To the young men volunteering for U-boat service, Prien represented everything they aspired to become: cold, calculating, merciless. The recruitment posters showed gray wolves prowling through storm-tossed seas, their conning towers cutting through waves like the dorsal fins of predators. These were not ordinary sailors. These were hunters, elites, the chosen instruments of the Reich's inevitable triumph. But beneath the propaganda, beneath the Knight's Crosses and champagne celebrations in Lorient and Kiel, the reality of U-boat warfare was already beginning to reveal its true nature. Each patrol lasted 8 to 10 weeks. The boats were designed for short coastal operations, not extended Atlantic hunting. Inside the pressure hull, space existed only for machinery, weapons, and the minimum volume of air required to keep men conscious. Submariners slept in shifts, hot bunking in narrow racks that smelled of the previous occupants' sweat and fear. Fresh food lasted 3 days. After that, they subsisted on canned sausage, hardtack, and condensed milk that tasted of metal. Water was rationed for drinking only. Men went weeks without washing. Their skin erupted in saltwater boils. Their teeth loosened from malnutrition. Dysentery swept through crews, forcing men to relieve themselves into buckets in the cramped forward torpedo room while their comrades worked inches away, loading half-ton weapons into firing tubes. The boats themselves were coffins waiting to be sealed. A Type 7 U-boat displaced 769 tons surfaced, had a maximum dive depth of 230 meters, and carried 14 torpedoes plus 220 rounds of 88mm deck gun ammunition. It could make 17 knots on the surface using diesel engines, but only 7 knots submerged on battery power, and batteries lasted only 90 minutes at full speed before requiring hours of surface recharging. In 1940, this was acceptable. Allied anti-submarine warfare remained primitive. British destroyers relied on ASDIC sonar that could barely detect submarines beyond 1,500 meters and often lost contact when U-boats dove below thermoclines. Aircraft patrols were limited by range and weather. Convoys sailed with minimal escort, often just 2 or 3 corvettes shepherding 40 merchant ships across thousands of miles of open ocean. Under these conditions, a well-commanded U-boat could stalk a convoy for days, attacking repeatedly under cover of darkness, submerging before dawn, then surfacing to pursue again the following night. The Grey Wolves expected this pattern to continue indefinitely. Dönitz promoted the mythology deliberately, understanding that morale depended on belief in German technical and tactical superiority. In training, instructors emphasized the U-boat's advantages: invisibility, surprise, the psychological impact of torpedo strikes that sent ships to the bottom in minutes. They showed recruits gun camera footage of tankers exploding, their cargoes of aviation fuel igniting in mushroom clouds visible for 50 kilometers. They played recordings of convoy radio chatter, British captains screaming into their microphones as their ships foundered, lifeboats capsizing in oil-covered seas. This was the reality the recruits absorbed. The enemy was vulnerable, disorganized, terrified. Victory was mathematically inevitable. What they did not show was the other side of the equation. What they could not acknowledge, even to themselves, was that American industrial capacity was about to enter the war, and when it did, everything would change. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first symptoms of a terminal disease. In late 1940, the United States remained officially neutral, but American shipyards were already building Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The Maritime Commission had standardized construction techniques, reducing the time to complete a 10,000-ton freighter from 230 days to 70 days. By 1941, American yards were launching 3 ships per day. By 1943, that figure would rise to 3 ships per day from a single facility, the Richmond Shipyard No. 2, where Henry Kaiser's assembly line methods transformed shipbuilding into industrial process indistinguishable from automobile manufacturing. For every merchant ship Dönitz sank, 4 more slid down American slipways. The mathematics he had relied upon inverted. But tonnage statistics remained abstract to the men sealed inside U-boats. What they experienced directly, what transformed their understanding of the war they were fighting, was the arrival of American destroyers. May 1941. U-110, commanded by Kapitän Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp, was depth-charged to the surface by HMS Bulldog, south of Iceland. Before the crew could scuttle her, British sailors boarded and captured an intact Enigma machine along with current code books. The intelligence coup remained classified for 30 years, but its effects rippled through the Battle of the Atlantic immediately. Convoy routing improved. U-boats found their patrol areas increasingly empty. When they did locate targets, escorts appeared with suspicious speed and accuracy. Then came the Americans themselves. After Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy deployed its destroyer escorts to the Atlantic in numbers that made mockery of the word escort. These were not the overworked corvettes that had defended convoys in 1940. These were purpose-built submarine killers, fast, modern, equipped with radar that could detect surfaced U-boats at 20 kilometers in total darkness. They carried Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars that fired patterns of 24 contact-fused projectiles in a 60-meter circle ahead of the attacking ship, eliminating the sonar blind spot that had previously allowed U-boats to escape while escorts passed overhead. Most devastating of all, they came in swarms. A typical mid-war convoy might sail with 8 to 12 destroyer escorts, plus 2 or 3 escort carriers providing continuous air cover. The hunters had become the hunted. U-boat crews experienced this reversal viscerally. Depth charge attacks that had once lasted 20 or 30 minutes now continued for hours, sometimes days. The charges themselves had improved. Torpex explosive increased destructive power by 50% over TNT. American depth charge patterns were tighter, more accurately placed. Detonations at 150 meters crushed light bulbs, shattered gauges, split seams in the pressure hull. Men vomited from concussion. Eardrums ruptured. The boat bucked and twisted like a living thing in agony. Between attacks, submariners lay in the darkness, lights extinguished to conserve battery power, listening to the destroyer's sonar pinging against the hull, each ping like a fingernail tapping on their coffin lid. Those who survived these encounters returned to port changed. The swagger was gone. They no longer spoke of invincibility. In the bars of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, veteran submariners sat hunched over their schnapps, chain-smoking, staring at nothing. They had seen friends crushed by water pressure at 300 meters, the hull imploding in a millisecond of unimaginable violence. They had surfaced after 20-hour depth charge barrages to find American aircraft circling, waiting, forcing them back down until the batteries died and they had to surface to face machine gun fire and rocket attacks. They had watched tankers. They torpedoed, burning on the horizon, while 4 destroyer escorts converged on their position with mathematical precision, sonar operators tracking every move, every attempt at evasion. The symbolic object that came to represent this transformation was the survival ration kit. When German submariners were pulled from the water by American ships, and increasingly, they were pulled from the water because American doctrine emphasized rescue over revenge, they encountered a level of material abundance that shattered their ideological framework. The standard American shipboard meal consisted of fresh meat, vegetables, bread, butter, coffee with real sugar and cream. Medical personnel treated captured Germans with antibiotics that did not exist in the Reich's inventory. The ships themselves were warm, dry, spacious. Sailors had individual bunks. Showers provided unlimited hot water. The food was so abundant that leftovers were discarded, thrown overboard, in quantities that would have fed a U-boat crew for a week. Oberleutnant zur See Wolfgang Luth, who survived the war as Germany's second most successful U-boat commander, wrote in his unpublished memoir of being captured after U-181 was sunk in 1944. They gave us chocolate. Not a single small piece, but entire bars, as many as we wanted. The American sailors ate beef and threw away what they did not finish. We had not seen fresh beef in 2 years. I realized then that we could not win. Not because of their weapons or their courage, but because of their abundance. A nation that throws away food is a nation that cannot be starved into submission. The psychological impact of this abundance cannot be overstated. Nazi ideology had prepared German submariners to despise Americans as soft, decadent, racially mongrelized, incapable of discipline or sacrifice. What they encountered instead was a military-industrial complex so vast, so productive, so materially overwhelming that it rendered German suffering meaningless. The U-boat crews had endured privation, hunger, cold, terror, all willingly accepted as necessary sacrifices for victory. Then they were captured and discovered that their enemies lived in comfort, fought from ships equipped with radar and sonar and radar-directed gunfire control systems that made surface combat a computational exercise rather than a test of will. The Americans did not need to be harder or more ruthless than the Germans. They simply needed to be more numerous, better equipped, and industrially inexhaustible. By 1943, the mathematics had become a slaughterhouse. In May alone, 43 U-boats were sunk. Dunitz called it Black May and temporarily withdrew boats from the North Atlantic. The withdrawal was tactical, but the symbolism was apocalyptic. The gray wolves were no longer hunting. They were being exterminated. Life expectancy for U-boat crews dropped to 2 patrols. New submarines were crewed by 18-year-olds who had never been to sea, commanded by 23-year-old officers who had been promoted because everyone senior to them was dead. They sailed from French ports, knowing they would not return. Some boats were sunk before they cleared the Bay of Biscay. Others survived long enough to send a single contact report before being obliterated by aircraft that appeared overhead in minutes, guided by radio direction finding equipment that triangulated transmissions with surgical precision. The final evolution of American anti-submarine warfare arrived in the form of the escort carrier. Small aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls. These ships carried 24 aircraft and sailed with every major convoy. Their planes, Grumman Avengers and Wildcats, patrolled in continuous rotation, using radar to locate surfaced U-boats, attacking with depth charges and rockets before the submarine could submerge. A U-boat surprised on the surface had perhaps 30 seconds to crash dive. If the aircraft reached attack position before the conning tower submerged, the boat was doomed. Depth charges set for shallow detonation would crush the control surfaces, rupture the hull, flood the engine room. The submarine would porpoise to the surface, crew boiling out of hatches into a storm of machine gun fire. Those who survived the sinking faced hypothermia. Atlantic water temperature in winter hovered around 4 degrees Celsius. Life expectancy in the water was 20 minutes, and still they sailed. Not because they believed in victory. By 1944, even the most fanatical Nazi understood the war was lost, but because refusing to sail meant execution for cowardice. Dunitz continued to send boats into the Atlantic not to sink ships, but to tie down Allied anti-submarine forces that might otherwise be redeployed to protect invasion beaches or merchant shipping in other theaters. The U-boat force had transitioned from strategic weapon to tactical sacrifice. The men knew this. They painted kill insignia on their conning towers not as celebrations, but as epitaphs. They wrote final letters before each patrol and left them with the base chaplain. They did not speak of victory or vindication. They spoke of duty and the hope that their families might survive the coming collapse. Between 1939 and 1945, 162 U-boats were commissioned into the Kriegsmarine. Of these, 783 were sunk by Allied action, 630 by British and Commonwealth forces, 153 by American forces, with the remainder destroyed by Soviet, French, and other Allied navies. An additional 215 were scuttled by their crews or surrendered at war's end. Approximately 28,000 German submariners died in action. Another 5,000 were captured. The U-boat service suffered a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any military branch in any nation during the Second World War. The Grey Wolves had been systematically annihilated. Günther Prien, the hero of Scapa Flow, vanished in March 1941 when U-47 was sunk by HMS Wolverine. His body was never recovered. Fritz Julius Lemp, who commanded U-110 when it was captured, died when a British sailor shot him as he attempted to reboard his boat to destroy the Enigma machine. Dunitz himself survived the war and served 10 years in prison for war crimes before being released in 1956. He never acknowledged that his strategy had been mathematically impossible from the beginning, that no number of U-boats could have severed Britain's Atlantic lifeline once American industry committed to the battle. In his memoirs, he blamed Hitler for interfering with naval operations, blamed the Luftwaffe for failing to provide reconnaissance, blamed British codebreakers for reading his signals. He did not blame the fundamental assumption that had doomed 28,000 men. the belief that will and ruthlessness could overcome industrial capacity. The U-boat pens remain. At Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, the massive concrete bunkers built to protect submarines from Allied bombing still stand, too solid to demolish economically. They are museums now, filled with periscopes and torpedo tubes and propaganda posters showing gray wolves prowling through storm-tossed seas. Tour guides explain the technical specifications of Type 7 and Type 9 boats. They show visitors the cramped crew quarters, the captain's closet-sized cabin, the diesel engines that filled the interior with toxic fumes. They do not mention that these same spaces became tombs for thousands of young men who believed themselves predators and discovered, too late, that they were prey. The gray waters of the North Atlantic keep their secrets. 783 U-boats rest on the bottom, scattered across 3,000 miles of ocean floor, many at depths that will never be explored. Inside those corroded hulls are the remains of men who called themselves wolves and hunted beneath the moon. They expected glory and found only darkness, cold, crushing, absolute. They believed in their superiority and discovered that abundance defeats ideology, that production defeats courage, that a nation which can afford to waste food will always defeat a nation that rations bread. The torpedoes are still there, unexploded, gradually corroding. The Enigma machines have dissolved into rust. The bones have long since dispersed into sediment. But the lesson remains, preserved in Admiralty records and war diaries and the unpublished memoirs of survivors who lived long enough to understand what they had experienced. Wolves hunt in packs because they are vulnerable alone. They are not apex predators, but opportunistic scavengers, powerful only when their prey is weak, scattered, undefended. When the prey organizes, when it develops weapons and tactics, an industrial system specifically designed to kill wolves, the pack is not defeated. It is exterminated. The gray wolves of the Kriegsmarine learned this lesson in the most visceral way possible, compressed into iron coffins at the bottom of the Atlantic, drowning in darkness, while above them, American Liberty ships steamed past in convoys so large they stretched from horizon to horizon. The wolves had discovered they were hunting sheep guarded by shepherds with machine guns. By then, it was far too late to stop hunting. All they could do was sail and dive and wait for the depth charges that would come inevitably, mathematically, like clockwork mechanisms ticking down toward zero. 783 boats, 28,000 men, all of them believers, until the moment the pressure hull imploded and belief became irrelevant. The ocean remembers. The records remember. History remembers the gray wolves not as they wished to be remembered, as predators, as elites, as hunters, but as they truly were. Men sealed inside machines, sent into an unwinnable battle by leaders who valued ideology over mathematics, courage over logistics, willpower over industrial reality. They called themselves wolves. The Americans called them targets. In the end, the Americans were correct. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.